Hello, Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. We actually don't have as much to talk about this week. I sort of hate when that happens, to be honest. Whenever we have a light show, I feel like there must be something big and obvious that I missed, but anyway, let's have at it. First, let's talk about a few updates. We previously discussed the issues with Exodii quadrupeds getting angry at the player. I'm not going to rehash it. I think, at this point we've discussed it 2 shows in a row, so you already know what is going on there. I just wanted to mention that Vanera has fixed this issue. Hopefully, this is the final resolution to that problem. I know a lot of people will be happy to see this go away. As for a second update, we previously discussed the new nested crafting recipes. I don't know how enthusiastic I came across in those videos. I often come across very dry and critical, but this was a genuinely pretty fantastic addition. I saw some people complaining about this, saying like, oh, what's the purpose of this? But I think that that's like an older player take, but I think that that's kind of a bad take. I think you should remember what it was like when you first started playing, before you knew like all the meta recipes. You didn't know what you were looking for. You would look through the crafting menu just recipe by recipe, which was very difficult when there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of recipes that you've never seen before. So I just wanted to point that out. I do think this is a good change. I didn't want people to take my previous things as complaining about a system that's actually really pretty good. But anyway, my one complaint was that when you selected a group of recipes, you were then whisked off to the nested tab with no way to go back to where you previously were. Well, this has now been remedied by Bombastic Slacks. Now, when you select a nested group of recipes, let's not use cuirasses as the example this week. Let's say that you select the Steel Arm Guards category. The recipes will appear as they previously did, moving you to the asterisk tab of the crafting menu. Within this category, there are then 3 more categories. If I select one, those recipes are then listed in a new sub-tab. If I want to go back to see what the other categories hold, I can just move left to the previous heading. If I then select a different group, it replaces the one that had been previously opened. The menu also remembers where you were previously, so if you're like me and you hit escape and accidentally close the whole crafting menu, these headings will still be there when it's opened once again. I didn't test this, but I assume this only persists until you exit the game, although we do have other filters that don't clear even when you close and reopen the game. But anyway, this addressed the singular issue that I saw with this new feature. And since we're talking about these nested recipes, it's also worth pointing out that they've been continually expanded over the last couple of weeks. I saw that A Nickel N had continued making more things use this nested system, as has the Shadow Ferret. Also, someone left me a comment on my last video talking about this, mentioning that they wished ammo would be nested in this way, and that is something that's being worked on, although it is not in the game yet. But that's enough about the updates. Let's move on now. Next up today, we've got some sheet metal armors from Aaron. While the PR says more sheet metal armors, so I assume that there already were some and I just missed them up until now. This PR added several items and crafting recipes for those items, the idea being that you're taking sheets of metal and roughly shaping them into some armor. All of them that I saw were auto-learned recipes that require fabrication 4 and tailoring 1. I'm a bit out of touch when it comes to selecting armor, but to me these seemed simple to make and provide pretty decent protection. The PR mentions them being pretty encumbering, but looking at the values, they all seem kind of low to me. I understand that they're not like full, thick, heavy pieces of traditional plate armor, so I guess I have no real thoughts on what they should be. They seem fine to me, but I had a general feeling of like, oh, the chest plate only has 10 encumbrance. That's less than a fully loaded heavy ballistic vest. But anyway, I guess that doesn't matter. I think these are good items because they fill a sort of like a middle tier of metal crafted armor. Historically, we've had full crafted pieces of armor which represented like properly forged plate mail or chainmail or whatever, but we've never really had a lot of makeshift metal armor. Well, that's not true because we had scrap armor, I guess, which were pretty good protection, but it depended on the piece of armor and generally was not worth it in my opinion. Anyway, I think it makes sense to have something a little bit more niche, and I think it's nice to have more recipes that use metal sheets, so overall I like this PR. Next up today from Night, we have the addition of a Backrooms mod. I don't usually cover mod content like ever, but this one seems pretty interesting. It is included with the game now, so it's an in-repo mod that is available to anyone who downloads a recent version of the game. Once you add the mod and go to create a character, you'll find that there is only a singular scenario available, and it's called Backrooms. This has the description of what is this place you can't seem to find your way back out. Now I'm sure some of you are familiar with the concept of backrooms. If not, I mean, and just give it a Google. There's memes and stuff and some background on it, etc. There were questions in the PR as to whether the Backrooms has any like copyright issues and blah blah, etc., but apparently it does not. Although people do associate it specifically with SCP, it did not originate there. But anyway, I don't care about any of that. Let's talk about Cataclysm. Once you get into the game, you're going to find that you're in the Backrooms, which is mostly just a bunch of maze-like hallways. There are sometimes rooms, and you will still come across enemies, and this is a pretty fascinating mod. It's very impressive what they were able to do using just the JSON files. However, in terms of the actual game, you playing and enjoying the game, I don't really know about this. The concept is wonderful, and the work that they've done is great, but the item spawns are so sparse that I don't really think it's viable for any length of a playthrough. Alright, and I'm just going to pop in here as the editor and delete everything that I had said about this mod. Initially in my recording, I had complained that there was not enough food and water to make it actually survivable. I was worried that you would meander around these back rooms and you would not actually be able to survive, and so that would make the mod sort of pointless. I thought it was a novelty. I thought it was just like a fun memey thing. And that was because I had originally tested this mod for like 5 minutes and I didn't really give it a chance. However, since then I have played about 30 minutes of this mod, and I think you could potentially survive here for a really long time. Now, it is fundamentally different from how we normally play Cataclysm. In the same way as if you were to play the In the Woods mod, it's still Cataclysm, it has all the elements of Cataclysm, but it's fundamentally different. But yeah, I'm going to recommend that you check out this mod. It's very easy because it comes with the game now, and it's definitely worth playing for a little bit. I find it really interesting. That said, I'm going to cut out everything I recorded before, so there might be an awkward cut passing you back here, but let's get back to the video. Now, I did want to point it out though, because, well, for one, because it's a meme, but also because it's genuinely impressive that the mod creator was able to make this. That person would be TG Weaver, by the way, credit where it's due. They made the mod, Knight just added it to the vanilla game. Well, I say just, there is still work involved with putting a mod into the main repo. I don't want to belittle that work either. Moving on though, next up today, we've had several PRs related to insect nymphs. Basically, these are small, young versions of the various insects that we've had added to the game. I'll just grab a random PR here. There were at least 3 of them that I saw. So looking at this one, we've got nymph, I can't say that word, nymph variants for mutant grasshoppers. This is from Carol1223, and apparently previously grasshopper eggs would hatch directly into a full-grown mutant grasshopper. Now this obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it furthers the inconsistencies that we've discussed at length about mutant insects. This PR made it so that not only is there a grasshopper nymph, but now the eggs will hatch into these smaller, more reasonable creatures. Like I said, there were at least 3 of these PRs that I saw, and maybe there are more that I did not see. I don't have a lot to say about them, but I do think it's a good change and it brings some sense to things. I really like the idea of having these like baby creatures in the game as opposed to them literally coming out of an egg the size of a minivan or whatever. Next up today, also from Carol1223, we've got a PR that makes it so that fish can finally breed. The way that this has been in the past is, like fish previously did sort of breed, but not really. Basically, if you were fishing, the game had some calculations to determine how many fish you would be able to catch. As you fished more in an area, the fish population would dwindle. If you stopped fishing in the area for a while, the population would then replenish. However, all of this was done in the background. These are not things you would actually see in the game. The actual fish creatures that you could see on the map in the game and attack them, those did not use that system. Once you had killed all the fish like quote-unquote monsters in the area, they were gone for good. This PR, however, makes it so that fish behave much like the other breeding animals in the game. They will produce roe, and that will eventually hatch into a baby fish. And although this probably sounds like a simple change, there was actually a fair bit of grunt work behind the scenes here. Carol took care so that when a fish would leave roe behind, it would be a roe that was specific to that breed of fish. In this way, a carp will leave behind carp roe, and that carp roe will eventually hatch into a carp baby. This means that they added a roe for every fish in the game, as well as a baby fish version of each type of fish. It's not overly complicated, but it was very probably pretty tedious to do this. In terms of the player though, you will not be able to tell the different types of roe simply by looking at them. As far as things go, the only impact on you as a player is that you're probably going to start noticing this fish breeding. Now I quite like this change just for like the virtue of what it is. It's unlikely to provide you with a steady supply of renewable food or anything like that that. There just aren't that many calories in a fish. However, like chickens, you could potentially keep them close by and eventually like farm them in some capacity. It is also worth noting that the roe itself does have some calories, although it's only 34, and all of the different species of roe are currently identical. They do not have different calorie counts or weights or anything like that. And the spoilage timer that I saw was set to 1 day, which is really fast. I assume this is to prevent you from storing them in your base, but obviously in the wild, in water, roe would last longer than a day. I worry that this short rot timer is going to lead to very fast fish breeding. If you didn't know, that's how eggs hatch in the Cataclysm. If I recall correctly, they rot and then they have a chance to spawn the creature. That's just, how it is. Or potentially that could have changed. I guess I don't know. However, I suspect that you will be seeing just ponds filled with baby fish pretty quickly as you start playing the game. However, that's enough about fish though. Let's move on. Next up today from Mail Clips, we had the addition of a mutant moose. These are called Great Tusked Moose. Man, that's just so hard to say things today. They should start commonly appearing as you get further into the game. I mention this because, mostly because moose are one of the iconic creatures that people like to meme about from this game, so yep. Now this great variety is larger and overall more dangerous than the regular moose. They have pretty decent bash and ballistic armor, but are surprisingly reasonable. I find that a lot of mutant animals that get added to the game have like insane stats, or they have way too much HP, things like that, but these creatures are actually pretty reasonable. I think they're a good fit as an upgraded like megafauna style moose without being completely ridiculous. This PR also added moose calves to the game. We've been seeing a lot of creatures get baby versions, so it's pretty nice to see this happen for moose as well. There are calves for the original moose as well as for the mutated version that we're talking about, and I like seeing the baby creatures come to the game. I think it fleshes things out. I don't know. Fallout New Vegas was like that too. It added baby versions of the various mutated creatures like mole rat pups and bighorn or calves, things like that. And I always really like that about that game and about other games as well. It's nice to have a representation of baby versions of the creatures that we see. Anyway, though, so Mutant Moose, good luck with that. Next up today from, there's no way I'm pronouncing this, Zeritsin? Right, anyway, this PR adds 2 new skeletal variants as possible upgrades for skeletal creatures in the game. This was originally part of a mod, Cataclysm, which I've never looked into, but they've been added to the core game now as well. One is a skeletal master and the other is a skeletal lich, and from those names you can probably extrapolate what their gimmick is. Basically, these are just skeletal versions of the master and necromancer. Now, that on its own is not going to have a huge impact on the game. You're already familiar with those type of creatures. It is essentially just a skeletal versions of the ones that we're familiar with. And as such, they have the sort of armor that skeletal zombies usually have, which makes them pretty resilient, so they're a little stronger than their normal counterparts. But the real reason that I wanted to talk about this is because it might have a noticeable impact on zombie evolution overall. If you've ever played the game for a really long time, or if you've used a scenario that starts you later in the apocalypse, you've probably seen a lot of skeletal juggernauts. There are certain creatures that appear over and over in the late game because they are basically like the pinnacle of the evolution trees. The skeletal juggernaut is one example of this. It is the final form, so to speak, for many creatures, especially skeletal creatures. However, these 2 new skeletal upgrades do not have evolutions. They are dead ends to that tree. A skeletal zombie that evolves into one of these 2 creatures will then stop upgrading. This means that later in the game it's possible that this will have an overall reduction of the number of skeletal juggernauts that you would encounter. And don't get me wrong, a necromancer or a master can be a real pain, especially if you can't deal with it very quickly. And this is especially true for these skeletal variants because they have additional armor. But ultimately they are much easier in my experience than dealing with a skeletal juggernaut. Now, how much of an impact is this actually going to have? I don't really know. It's hard to tell what exactly is monster evolution and what are the spawn tables in the late game experience, but I am curious if this is going to have a noticeable impact on those end game enemies. Anyway, hopefully you get what I'm saying here. Let's just move on to the next thing. And then finally today, let's talk about aluminum. There was a PR several weeks ago that I had planned to cover in a previous episode, but ultimately I cut it for time. Well, there was a follow-up PR recently, so I figured, we we should talk about this now. These are also from Carol1223. We've talked a lot about their changes today. Now, a while back, aluminum scrap was added to the game. This was essentially just really small pieces of aluminum, just like we have steel scrap metal in the game. And the PR from a couple weeks ago also did quite a lot of things related to that metal. It rebalanced aluminum costs for several recipes. It added disassembly recipes for several items so that they now give aluminum. It added several completely new items, and it made some recipes able to use this new scrap aluminum, in addition to some other things, as though that wasn't enough. Now, I'm not going to cover everything, but this was obviously a pretty major expansion for aluminum, something that was previously, well, honestly, it barely existed in the game. All you could really make with aluminum was ultralight vehicle frames. This was expanded to include aluminum boat hulls and an aluminum step ladder. Those were the two things that really jumped out at me. And there were initially two sizes of aluminum drums added to the game as well, although they were later converted into vehicle tanks. Apparently, I think large drums aren't usually made of aluminum, and that's why it was changed later. Now, the recipes are still pretty limited. There just isn't that much in the game that we have that we can craft out of aluminum. The second PR, which was added just a few days ago, that did add a recipe for a foldable ultralight frame. But if we have a look at the crafting menu and we search by component for aluminum, well, we'll find a lot of things that use like aluminum cans or aluminum foil. And if we look specifically for the new scrap aluminum item, we find less than 24 recipes. The list that uses aluminum ingots is even smaller. That's not to say this isn't a good PR or anything like that. I'm just pointing out that despite the addition, aluminum is still definitely underrepresented in the game. There's just not that much that you as the player can do with this item. And the second PR has added scrap aluminum to quite a few deconstruction recipes, so you will start seeing it show up a little bit more as you play. But that's all I really have to say about that though. Despite being pretty large changes, aluminum remains a less desirable material with limited uses. This is especially true because most players have been working with steel for a really long time. It would take some time to transition other metal items into having aluminum counterparts. However, as more of these type of PRs happen, that will continue to change. For example, I just saw Carol on Discord a minute ago, and they said that they already had a third PR for aluminum that I haven't seen yet. If nothing else, you can try your hand at making some aluminum welding rods or putting some aluminum boat hulls on your vehicle, things like that. But anyway, I guess that's it for today's show. I wanted to talk more about aluminum because it pleases me to see it being expanded, but there's just not that much practical use stuff for your average playthrough, so, or at least not that I noticed. Everyone, thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, maybe learned something, whatever, I don't know. Thanks for being here, and I'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode, so I'll see you next time.